Thank you very much, Daniel, for your introduction. I'm going to be quite boring and read out my presentation. I will talk about female religious authority in Muslim majority contexts, past examples, and modern state initiatives. There are numerous examples of female religious authority in the history of Islamic civilizations. Although many of the women who held religious authority in the past remain largely unknown, a growing body of literature over the past 2 decades has attempted to highlight the role and importance of some in their various roles, from transmitters of hadith. Ahadith are traditions of Prophet Muhammad, authoritative reports of his deeds or sayings, to women being judges and scholars of fiqh, jurisprudence. So this paper gives a brief historical overview of female religious authorities in the history of Islam, and focuses on contemporary trends and current state initiatives occurring in the Hawze, so Hawze Elmiye, which are Islamic seminaries within the Sharia context. Actually wondering if everybody can hear me, hopefully, and yeah, okay, I'll continue. The Iranian context will look at the training, social presence, and influence of female religious authorities. Although religious education and religious authority are ultimately connected, one should not equate the two. This study observes that women who complete higher levels of Islamic education do not necessarily become religious authorities. The paper brings to light spaces created by state initiatives for women in fields that historically been dominated by men, such as the study of Islamic sciences and jurisprudence. Iranian female Tullab, Hawze students, are overturning the female monopoly on religious discourses due to a rapid increase in state-sponsored female religious education. This article also argues that education of female religious authorities in Iran is linked to a state control of religion and religiosity. The example of Turkey is also occasionally used as a point of comparative reference while examining what is unique about Iranian state control of religion and religiosity through education. In this regard, the present article also draws upon a history of Turkish state sponsorship in the development of waize, female preachers, and vice muftis or muftiyas, female jurists qualified to issue non-binding legal opinions. Although the paper doesn't make attempt at normative or critical argumentation in the Turkish context. So I will give a very brief, kind of more anecdotal examples of historical accounts of Muslim women as religious authorities. There are historical records of women who held varying degrees of religious authority, dating back to the first generation of Muslims, Salaf. These dynamics of female religious authority merit closer scrutiny, especially given recent initiatives to train and certify women as religious scholars and vice muftis in Muslim majority contexts and countries. These state initiatives differ from the historical account in two significant ways. First, more informal and one-to-one teacher-student method for knowledge transmission have been largely replaced by public university-style education. In Iran, this has gone hand in hand with the reform of the Hawze and the trend for the Hawze education to mirror more closely university-style pedagogy and degrees. Likewise, in Turkey, waizes are widely recruited from amongst female religious and theology graduates of Turkish universities. Second, these state initiatives greatly outpace historical accounts in terms of the sheer rise in the number of students who have been affected by such a shift in religious discourse and leadership preparation. So early Muslim women played an active and dynamic role in the initial preservation, transmission, and interpretation of the Quran and Hadith. Hafsa bint Umar, one of Muhammad's wives, is an important figure, particularly in terms of textual preservation and formation of the Quran. Hafsa was regarded as an authority on the oral and written Quran by her father, the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. Reportedly, she was able to recite, read, write, and edit Quranic texts. Aisha bint Abu Bakr, Maymuna, Salama are other named wives of Muhammad who are credited for the transmission of thousands of ahadith. Another noteworthy figure in early Islam is Waraqa, who memorized the Quran, following which the Prophet asked her to lead her household in prayer, which she did repeatedly. Scholars such as Asma Afsaruddin, Fatima Mernisi, Asma Barlas, Leila Ahmed have laid the groundwork for women-centric study of Islamic society by casting light on the lives of such women who accompanied the Prophet. Just as the life of Muhammad is held as an example for emulation, so too the lives of his companions, including women of his household, have been used as examples of devotion throughout Islamic history. It's possible to begin to gauge the changes in the agency and influence of women in Islam by examining how the first generation of Muslim women face fewer barriers in commenting on and interpreting Islamic sacred text, while the generations that followed primarily functioned as transmitters rather than as interpreters of the tradition. Ruth Rudditt draws attention to many of the female religious scholars who worked during the medieval Islamic period. And also we have the work of Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, who gives an extensive overview of the role of some 8,000 women who were transmitters of hadith, muhaddithat, also theologians and jurists during this time. However, after the Sahabiyat, women contemporaries of Muhammad, who were basically his companions, fewer accounts of women religious scholars and authorities exist in biographical dictionaries. But some work, I won't go through them for the interest of time, works of Asma Afsaruddin, who I do cite in this work, and also Arzu Azad are notable in talking about some of these women. As Islam expanded territorially, religious rhetoric around gender became increasingly affected by the patriarchal structure of local cultures to which Islamic norms were being adapted. According to Afsaruddin, most jurists and theologians by 15th century had decided that leadership of prayer of mixed congregation was not an appropriate role for women, and that various women best exercise their virtue within the confines of their home. However, while such structural changes did not necessarily decrease respect for the learning of women per se, their social implications equated to less opportunity for the public mediation of religion through gendered structures of power. Consider this, for instance, Shilbiya, a 16th century Castilian woman. Again, I'm going to cite Asma Afsaruddin, who writes that she, Shilbiya, gained renown for her remarkable knowledge of Islamic law and jurisprudence, so much so that it became widely circulated that there was a qadi, a judge in Lucena, Shilbiya's husband, whose wife surpassed him in knowledge of the law and of judicial proceeding. Al-Maqarri reports that at judicial assemblies, Al-Shilbiya's husband, before uttering any legal pronouncement, would consult with her and she would indicate to him the correct legal decision. So against such histories, the very significant role of women as transmitters of a scholarly tradition through the centuries is clearly not yet fully understood in institutional or public terms. In theory and practice, women have occupied authoritative roles and have been recognized as religious scholars throughout the history of Islam. However, in most cases, the authority they have yielded, regardless of their scholarly standing, has been limited, mainly due to male-dominated structure of Islamic religious authority. At the same time, in the past 40 years, there has been a shift in the discourse, structure, and perception of female religious authority in Muslim majority contexts, during which time the number of female religious leaders of different ranks has increased considerably. A relevant portion of this increase owes to a state sponsorship of religious education for women. As Hilary Kalmbach writes, growth of female religious leadership is inherently linked to larger social, religious, and political changes that have impacted Muslim communities since the early 20th century. The state initiatives are largely programs to control religion and religiosity and propagate a statist interpretation of Islam. In the majority of contexts, women's religious authority does not extend beyond female-specific spaces, for example, female-only congregations or ruling that apply to female-specific issues. Therefore, these women's authority often does not encompass the same domain as that of their male counterparts. Nonetheless, more and more women are occupying explicitly religious spaces, such as mosques in different ways, as well as attending once male-dominated madrasas and houses. Against the backdrop of an increase in state-funded programs for women religious education, this paper considers the Iranian context in terms of state funding and support for women's religious leadership, alongside some limited attention to female wa'ez preachers in Turkey as a point of comparison. So we go now in kind of to more modern looking, mainly at Iran, but also Turkey. The inauguration of the Islamic Republic of Iran, 1979, was followed by a series of Islamization initiatives. Women, many of whom were participants in revolution, were faced with a series of misogynistic laws and decrees. These laws were imposed by the new state to limit women's access to many of the public domains. The state's control of women's bodies became a strategy of the hardline regime, whose Islamization projects extended to controlling women's behavior and appearance. With the rise of political Islam, Iranian women were projected as a homogeneous entity, and their chador-cladded bodies became a symbol of the Islamic Republic. State intervention and its own brand of Islamization were also extended to the education sector, including the Hawza. Religious education in Iran, in particular Hawza education, has gone through a period of substantial change since 1979 Islamic Revolution. The institution of the Hawza in Najaf in Iraq and Qom, Iran, has historically been a center of religious learning for the Shia. Traditionally, religious learning in the Hawza was organized around high-ranking clerics such as Marja, source of emulation of the time. As Robert Gleave writes, amongst the changes occurring within the Hawza is the gradual move towards a centralized bureaucracy and a formalization of educational qualification. I'll just make sure I have the right pages. This brings us then to in Iran, where the educational reform has been linked with state intervention within the Hawza. The state influence and intervention in the Hawza extends to educational reforms to standardize curricula under مرکز مدیریت حوزه علمیه, the Center for Management of the House. Gleaves notes that presently in Iraq, Iran, and elsewhere, the House has to recruit students who might be tempted by more formal and internationally recognized qualification. He concludes that recognizing this new competitive context is at least part of the reason for reforms the House has witnessed in the kind of basically the last half century. This process of reform generally entails substantial state financial support and ideological influence. In this reform process, the number of House students has increased. With those increased numbers has come increased relevance and influence also. Another substantial change in the House has been sharp increase in number of female tullab, so talabe basically House students. The tullab have historically, due to the segregated and male-centric structure of the House, been mostly men. However, given the visible participation of women in the in the House and the increase in the number of female houses across Iran, the Iranian talabe is no longer stereotypically a turban-wearing man. In fact, Elahe Nouri, who's done actually really excellent, one of the only kind of comprehensive studies of the House, has observed that the female House students have now surpassed their male counterparts in number. Against the backdrop of this increase, there is limited research conducted both inside and outside of Iran to shed light on the path of female House students during their studies and upon graduation. So as I said, the Elahe Nouri's study is one that is quite comprehensive. She was very kind. She shared it with me before she actually published it. But access to female houses is actually really, really difficult. It's difficult from the outside, from not being in the country, but even if you're in the country, it's quite difficult to get access. She had access. My understanding is that she herself also, even though she has a university education, but she was also a student of the House. The male institution of Ruhaniyat, the clergy post 1979, clearly continues to have a strong social and political presence and influence in Iran. The influence of the female Rouhani is more difficult to discern. A point of comparison to the House is the Imam Hattepe schools in Turkey. These are Islamic schools which offer vocational education and, according to Irene Özgur, provide the most prominent exception to the rule of secular education in Turkey. The schools were set up in 1924 with a mandate to train male students to become prayer leaders, imams, and preachers, Hatteps. However, according to Kandiyoti and Emanat, they have become the cornerstones of national education. The establishment of Imam Hattepe schools was direct consequence of the 1924 unification of education law, which brought all education institutions under the management of the Ministry of Education, thereby eliminating the Ministry of Sharia and Charitable Endowments. According to Mona Hassan, Imam Hattepe schools were opened in place of closed madrasas to train male imams and preachers. The establishment of separate Imam Hattepe schools for girls occurred in mid-1970s. Mehmet Tarhan points out that by 1990, girls formed a quarter of all Imam Hattepe school students. By the end of the decades, girls accounted for almost half of all Imam Hattep secondary school students. Irene Özgur also observes that throughout the first decade of the 21st century, the schools with social tumult shifted from margins of the Turkish education system to position of prestige, controversy, and influence. Following political shifts in the country, an increasing number of female graduates from Imam Hattepe schools began to enter the university system and theological faculties, ultimately impacting the Turkish presidency of religious affairs, the Diyanet. So back to Iran. In Iran, despite the fact that reforms have led to the expansion of religious education opportunities for women, there has not been a concurrent and proportional increase in the number of women wielding religious influence as leaders. However, the sharp rise in the number of female Hausa students has arguably had an impact on public opinion, especially with regard to the gendered nature of Rouhani. The integration of women seminarians into institution of Rouhaniyat is supported by Nouri's observation that Hausavi women have an independent existence. Numerically, they equal those of the male Talabe, and even in recent years, they have outnumbered men. So, I haven't done statistical research on this. This is according to Nouri. Research conducted by Nouri between 2006 and 2016 establishes that the number of female seminarians has increased substantially from 32,000 to 75,000. The same study places the total number of female Hausa graduates at 90,000. According to the official website of Markaz Mudiriyat Hawzeh Elmiye Khaharan, the Center for Management of Female Seminaries, there are currently 481 houses for women spread across Iran. In her study, Nouri highlights the attraction of Hausa education for women from specific sectors of society, including women from religious and conservative families, as well as women who, due to a variety of factors, are unable to access university education. The latter choose the Hausa as an alternative to university, as at the end of their high school, at the end of their high school education. Due to modern educational reform, they will gain a third-level degree comparable to one obtained at universities. According to Amine Tawassil, women's access to Hausa education became a nationwide project by the early 1990s. One aspect that distinguishes the course and direction of theological training for women in Iran from that of women in Turkey is that is the opportunity for employment and leadership upon graduation. While in Turkey, the YZs have set employment opportunities, Iranian female graduates do not have the same kind of job security. Furthermore, women Hausa students and graduates in Iran have tended to view their main role and duty as lying within the domestic context. The ideal of motherhood and marriage takes priority for many of them over career. Therefore, many do not seek nor are able to avail of employment in religious and legal professions. Despite greater access to education, their post-educational prospects are significantly curtailed by social and economic factors. Sakurai articulates this dynamic in the following way. The establishment of Jamiat Zahra, the first official female seminary in post-revolutionary Iran, opened new possibilities for women to enter the male-dominated clerical hierarchy, as opposed to the male seminaries whose dominant role is to train mujtahids who can issue a competent legal opinion. The primary role of female seminaries is to train educators and propagandists. In contrast to Iran, where the growing number of female Hausa graduates trained as educator and propagandists lack job security, creating what is essentially a women's educational bubble, the Diyanet has in recent years recruited female graduates of theological faculties and appointed them as Waizas and Wais Muftis, both fields previously dominated by men. So I have a good bit on Turkey. I'm going to skip it for the benefit of time and go more in detail and talk about the Hausa for another few minutes. So let's see. So in the Iranian context, it's not only the traditional kind of, going to the house and then being a religious authority. But it's, sorry, I probably shouldn't have skipped it now. It kind of broke my train of thought. So basically, very quickly, like with the Turkish model, the Vaizalars and the Muftiyats, they have more authority than Iranian women do. And so where the Turkish model focuses on professional vocation, the emphasis in the Iranian context has been on ethical influence and institutional formation offered by a house education. So in her research, Nouri identifies two main types of house students in Iran. The first type she terms as ta'aligara. These women are spiritually oriented and enter the house mainly to attain a spiritual grace, kasb feiz ma'navi, and to increase their religious knowledge. Many of the ta'aligara women have a religious worldview and consequently regard the house as a holy space, much like shrines of the Shia Imams or mosques. So any activity, including education, undertaken in such spaces is therefore deemed spiritually valuable. Reading and learning material with religious content becomes part of their search for a spiritual completeness and divine satisfaction. Some of these women also regard it as their religious duty to study Islamic sciences, and the house provides these women with the necessary structure to fulfill what they seem as religious responsibility or obligation. The house is regarded as a safe space for women due to its gendered segregated nature. There is no or very little interaction with men, and men's access to women's houses is difficult without ample prior arrangement having been made. The only men who frequent the house are male professors. In an interview conducted with a house student, and this is again from the interviews that Nouri shared with me, she stresses the difference in atmosphere of the house compared to universities due to its single-sex nature. Her interviewee relates, I am not saying that the house environment is 100% healthy, so she means in a moral sense. However, there is relative calmness, and this calmness is possibly due to the fact that the environment is 100% for women, and apart from male professors, you're not stressed, as my friends who are in university, who are in other universities, tell me that a man one day criticizes your hijab, the next day, the way you're walking, and the day after, the way you're sitting, your mind becomes preoccupied and you are not able to concentrate on your studies. So men's lack of access to this environment means that there is no men to control women's bodies. But of course, this is just around the spaces, because in some ways the whole veiling and segregation by itself is a sign of control of women's bodies and spaces. Although women houses are public institutions, women from families with clear gender roles find it comfortable to transition from the private realm of the family to a public but segregated and controlled house environment. In broader terms, these post-revolutionary segregated spaces have been constructed to give religiously conservative and traditional women unprecedented access to public participation. Another important factor that attracts women to the house is its flexibility, in particular for married women and mothers. As Nouri suggests, house education generally takes longer than university education, due to its flexibility inherent to house education. Women, especially women who are, who have children, are quite attracted to this. For the women engaged in it, house education is viewed in terms of necessary duty. Hence, it should continue regardless of the number of years devoted to it. The house also caters well for women with more traditional conception of gender, where marriage and motherhood tends to be highly valued. The Hausa tolerates longer absences for women with families, and it's possible to take time out of lectures to breastfeed or take extended maternity leave. Often, Hausa also provides childcare facilities for women with children. Therefore, the Hausa environment supports and nourishes a notion of womanhood constructed by the Islamic revolution and valued by traditionalists. Tawasil refers to the Hausavi women as women who conceive of building a Shia Islamic society as an end to oppressive conditions. So these are kind of very conservative, revolutionary women who oppressive conditions for them are kind of, Western reformist ways of life. She writes, they work on strengthening that vision through the state and their Islamic education. In other words, the Hausavi women positively negotiate their traditional roles as mothers and wives to advance their access to education. Within this normative framework, a maternal posture of nurturing belief rooted in a revolutionary political context is supported by the study of Islamic sciences made available in Hausa education. This provides a means and rationale for a study beyond employment. Tawasil's research helps underscore that women Tullab are not passive participants of religious education. Rather, they choose to arm themselves with religious knowledge in order to help advance a social vision to which they are committed. As a result, they can sometimes uproot normative expectation through religiously claimed agency, even as their rationale remains squarely within a traditional framework. One example she gives in this regard concerns those Hausavi who express their desire to delay marriage to further their Islamic education, an expression that often involved using Islamic texts and stories of unmarried women in Islamic history to debate their seniors or teachers. Tawassil also underscores their insistence was on delaying marriage and motherhood rather than remaining unmarried. Yet the deployment of knowledge as a lever of social power is a strategy visible within the family following marriage as well. For instance, in the fieldwork Tawassil does, she notes that the Hausavi practice of asking their husband for permission to who could enter their homes and also leaving their homes. And also who to leave their children with was a display of their observing eta'at, obedience, which is kind of a religious duty. She recalls that while she initially registered these questions as an example of mere consultation, her fieldwork amongst the Hausavi led her to understand that this was both a religious obligation and a source of mobility. The process allowed the Hausavi to authenticate her expansive knowledge of Islamic contract law, including marriage contracts in which parties to a contract were obliged to fulfill its condition. Relative to one Hausa student, Mariam, Tawassil observes the performance of asking permission is her evidence that she is in fact a knower of Islamic law. She held the power of that assessment. She continues, framed in this manner, itaat to Muhammad, Mariam's husband, the person she is studying, authenticated her knowledge and enabled her to continue learning, working, and attempting to excel in her endeavor. Her expertise allowed Mariam to transform her surrounding by teaching about the rights of women in Islam. Examples such as Mariam's demonstrate how Iranian female tullab are constantly negotiating spaces and authority. So in a previous study I conducted with Miriam Kunkler, we examined the curriculum of Jamatul Zahra, the largest center for theological training for women in Iran. And one which is actually independent of Markaz Mudiriyat Hawze Elmiye Khaharan. And it's really interesting actually again to kind of to see the extent of the number of women who come through these educational institutions. But again, one thing that's really difficult to discern is what do these women actually do? So a lot of them, these places for a study of Islamic sciences usually should yield more religious authority, but actually either women go back to private spaces, kind of back to home, or certain other roles for them are such as like becoming teachers, but religious teachers, but also muballigh, which is propagandists. It really doesn't have the same structure as the Turkish system has. So therefore, although the expansion of religious education within the Hausa has given Iranian women, in particular those from traditional and disadvantaged backgrounds, access to third-level education, the Hausa education remains confined to a statist interpretation of Islam, wherein female tullab are trained to promote a state's interests rather than being educated to assume religious authority. So I think I spoke enough. I'll leave it here, and I'd be happy to discuss any questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Roja. That was a fantastic paper, really fascinating, and the kind of content that you wish could be sort of made more public, right? This is a really fascinating story of the role of women in Islam, the historical role, and the case studies you had from Iran and Turkey. So yeah, really insightful and interesting. Thanks so much. Do you mind making me a co-host if that's possible?
Yeah,
and then
of course. How do I do it? You have to
go to my name and then go to
your name.
the blue box should appear if you
see, it doesn't
in the panelists.
In the panelists. I see. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm gonna make you a host now.
I demoted myself. Oh, thank you. Okay. So I'll stop the recording there because perhaps people want to not have the recordings questions recorded. So